Hi everybody, this is Mountain Mama, and this is another episode of The Ugly Beautiful Truth, all about adoption, post-adoption, pre-adoption, and during the process of adoption. This episode is going to be about the types of adoption. No matter where you are in the process of adoption, you're going to find that adoption is very, very, very complicated. It takes a long time, and there are many, many steps to the adoption process. If you're in the pre-adoption process, you're going to be overwhelmed with a lot of information, a lot of choices. One of the things I'm going to cover today is just the types of adoptions. The ugly truth is there are so many kinds of adoptions, you're going to be overwhelmed by the choices, and it's going to take you a while to figure out the kind of adoption that works for you and your family. And you may start out pursuing international adoption or domestic adoption or foster care, and that may change for you. You may get in the middle of a process and decide that it's not for you. There are some fundamental things that are the same about the adoption process. That is, you need a home study. Whether you're doing international adoption, domestic adoption, and there's domestic private adoption. There's kinship adoption. That's generally through foster care, but it can be, you can do a private adoption where there's kinship. Kinship is where you are related in a familial way, and or sometimes they call kinship an established relationship with the child or an established relationship with the family, like a close friend of the family. So that the ugly truth of it is it's a lot of information, and there is not just one simple, easy, quick way to grow your family through adoption. And you have to decide for yourself after a lot of research and maybe a lot of stops and starts what is going to work for you and your family. As I said a few minutes ago, there are fundamental things that are the same with all those adoptions. There's always going to be an attorney involved, most of the time, and there should be. There's always going to be a home study, so you'll have to have a home study at a certain point. There'll always be background checks. It can be pretty invasive, but there is a reason for it being invasive. They want to make sure that you are the best fit for any child that comes into your home. And so you just kind of have to get comfortable with that. But let's talk about the main kinds of adoption. Like I said, there's subcategories of adoption within these, okay? Within foster, you have regular foster care, and then you have foster to adopt. Foster is not really adoption, but foster to adopt is adoption. I'll get into that. I'll do a separate video with more details on each type, but for now, this is just an overview. Then there are kinship adoption within that arrangement of foster care. That is one of our adoptions, was a kinship placement. It was a relative. Our oldest daughter was a relative, but 3 of our other children were not. There is international adoption. Everybody's familiar with international adoption, and that is where you choose to sign with an agency that works with orphanages in other countries to adopt a child and bring them into your home. That has a whole host of other things with it. You still have to have an attorney. You still will have background checks. You will still have to have a home study. Those, and I'll break those down in other videos. You also have domestic adoption, domestic private adoption. And within that you can have a closed adoption or an open adoption. That's a whole other can of worms. And I'll talk about all of that later too. 3 of our adoptions are open. 1 of them is closed. So I'll talk about open and closed adoptions in another video. But you have domestic adoption, which is where you adopt a child that is not necessarily in foster care, and they are matched. The birth family, there's either an attorney who facilitates, or there's an adoption agency. Some people use facilitators. There's so much that encompasses that. But it's a child that you adopt within the United States, if you are in the United States, of course. Whatever country that you are in, and you're adopting domestically, you're adopting a child that is within your country. So those are the 3 main kinds of adoption, but within that there's subcategories. Foster to adopt, international adoption, and then domestic private adoption. We started out initially on the waiting list to adopt internationally. We were on the waiting list for China. We were on the waiting list for Vietnam. then our plan changed, and I'll go into that another time. And then we ended up doing foster care, foster to adopt, and then we have also done a domestic private adoption. So we've had a little bit of experience with all of those, and I could say a lot about them. And it's very hard. It was very messy. Each type of adoption has its own set of baggage, as it were, and its own set of steps. And there are pros and cons for each of those. With international adoption, there's some pros and cons. With domestic adoption, there's pros and cons. With foster to adopt, there's pros and cons. And I will talk about the pros and cons of each of those in the separate videos that address international adoption, domestic adoption, and foster to adopt. I'm not going to address those now because I don't want this video to be too long. But the ugly truth is, adoption is not simple. There's a lot of choices, and it's a lot of information to wade through. The beautiful truth about all of these kinds of adoptions is one of them will be perfect for your family. The process won't be perfect, but one of them will fit the needs of your family. So on one hand, it's really good that there's no one-size-fits-all with adoption. Yes, there are some consistencies with all adoptions, which are good. And yes, each type of adoption needs huge improvements in the process of those types of adoptions. But the beautiful thing is overwhelming as it may be, you will find the right fit for your family. And in that way, you can sort of customize what feels right for you. When we first started out, I never, ever thought that I would adopt domestically or through foster care. I was literally petrified of birth-family relationships. So from the get-go, I mean, I'm not now because we have 3 open adoptions. And, you know, it's funny how you make plans and then whatever you believe in, you know, whatever your faith is, you know, sometimes that higher power, whoever you believe in, whatever you believe in, has other plans for you. For me, all along, I had thought we would be doing international adoption because I was afraid. I didn't want to go through the process of losing any children, getting so attached, and then going through that loss of, or even having birth family involvement. But now I'm really experienced in that. And it's funny how when you make plans, life has other plans for you. You know, so all along we thought we would do international adoption at first. Years later, when all of those processes or all of those, but it's funny how years later, after hitting roadblock after roadblock with international adoption, our family fell into foster to adopt, where we had a foster kinship placement. And my greatest fear became my reality. But that's how our family grew. I'm sorry if you hear an automobile in the background. I'm doing this on my porch just to have a little privacy while baby's napping. I call her my baby, but she's 3, you know. Anyway, but it is funny how you start out thinking you're going to do one kind of adoption, and then you either research the process or you get in the middle of that process and find that's not exactly going to work out. Well, we kept hitting roadblock after roadblock. You know, I could go into that. China changed their laws at that time while we were on the process, and I have a type of dwarfism, a rare type of dwarfism, and there's a few other restrictions that they implemented. And so while we were in the middle of waiting, all of a sudden we no longer qualified. Now they reconsidered that. Now we could adopt from China again, internationally now, but I can only adopt, is my understanding now, a child who has dwarfism, because I have dwarfism, a type of dwarfism, a rare type. You know, there are just certain restrictions, and so we no longer qualified for that. We fell into the foster adopt after we were on the waiting list for Vietnam for a couple of years, and in that process with an agency, then their country laws changed at the time, And there's a lot with that. I'll talk about that with the Hague Convention. Just there's a lot with that. But that program shut down at that time. This is a few years ago, for a while. And countries do that. So my big grand plan for international adoption, so I wouldn't have to have the heartbreak of losing my kid through dealing with birth families. And I say dealing with them, and I don't mean it in any derogatory way, because now we have that experience where we have open adoption, and we do co-parent, as it were, with birth families through open adoption. I'll explain that later. So you may start out with one type of adoption and end up growing your family through a different kind. We fell into foster to adopt, and then due to a need of a family member. So while we were doing kinship foster care and learning about that and getting the training and working with the foster care system, I don't know, it just became this great passion of mine. And the fear of, well, I'll tell you what broke the fear, actually, was, well, there was a lot. I could talk about that. I'll talk about that another video. I'm going to put a pin in that for a minute. But that could get into a long story, so I'll put a pin in that for just a little bit. But we actually, in the middle of doing foster care, had a situation come through LPA, Little People of America, because I'm a member of Little People of America. I'm not sure, the Little Couple, if y'all have ever watched The Little Couple, and they matched with their children, Will and Zoe, through LPA, through the organization that deals with, that we're all a part of, Little People of America. And so we were matched in a similar way, and we had a daughter through domestic adoption. And we went and we got our daughter, and we had our daughter, and I will go into that story another time, but it fell through. I'm not giving the details. So my greatest fear came true. We had to hand over our daughter. And I survived. And then it was like, okay, my heart kept on beating. It was like a death. I'll talk about that experience another time, when we're talking about domestic adoption. But through that, we continued to foster and adopt, And eventually, our 3-year-old came to us through domestic adoption. But during that time, we also ended up adopting 2 of our children through foster to adopt. I'll go into that story another time if anybody's interested, to some degree. And then we also ended up adopting our kinship placement, our oldest daughter. And this is over a period of 10 years. Like I said, in 10 years we fostered, and another video I had said, we fostered 26 kids. But our adoptions really happened pretty quickly. They were, in about 5 years, 5-6 years, we had 4 kiddos that became our forever children. But I get a little sidetracked, but the reason I say that in The Ugly Beautiful Truth is to say, you may start out feeling overwhelmed. You may be saying, there's all these kinds of adoption. Which one is right for our family? Or you may get discouraged. When we tried international adoption and that didn't work out, a lot of people told us, well-meaning friends and family told us, well, maybe it's not in the plan for y'all. Maybe you should give up. Or after it'd been a couple years, maybe you should give up. And that's okay. Some people do. They decide, you know what, they don't want to go through the process, and that's an individual thing, and that's okay. Or that it's too much for them or their marriage. It took us 17 years and many kinds of adoption, stops and starts and research and processes before we became a family through adoption. Now, we were fostering some during that time, but it took us a total of 17 years before we became a family, forever family, through adoption. So I'm here to tell you, like I said in my other videos, I am no expert. I don't work for an agency. I'm not an attorney. I don't work for DSS, Department of Children's Services. The only thing that makes me qualified to tell you about these kinds of adoptions and talk about adoption, the ugly, beautiful truth about adoption, is that I've walked the walk. I'm a mom of 4, and I've walked this journey So I can tell you from our perspective what our journey has been like. Things you may need to know ahead of time. So the beautiful truth in all of it is, when the time is right, your family can and will grow through adoption. You will meet your kids, and it will happen in whatever way it's going to happen, through international, through domestic, through kinship, foster to adopt, whatever. Don't get so focused on one kind or one type of adoption that you lose sight of the choices out there. So the ugly truth is, there's a lot of choices. The beautiful truth is, there's a lot of choices. So yeah, that may sound kind of wonky, or it may sound kind of ambiguous, but that is the truth of the matter. So think about international adoption, think about domestic adoption, think about foster to adopt. There are a couple 100,000 children in the United States in foster care right now, waiting on a forever family. If you can foster, do it. Hi everybody, this is Mountain Mama, and this is another edition of The Ugly Beautiful Truth.